In 1952, a far-off corner of the world, at least to the United States, became the focus of a National Geographic magazine cover story. Its title, Indochina Faces the Dragon. Indochina, of course, referred to, in part, Vietnam. And in 1952, the United States was secretly funding 90% of the French colonial war to keep Vietnam, Indochina, in its sphere of influence. Little did we know in 1952 that in less than 10 years the United States would become more and more involved after the French pulled out and the US decided, in the name of containment, to take over the French role in fighting against communist rebels who came to rise after the French departure and Vietnam being split into two separate northern and southern regions. By 1965, after Lyndon Johnson became president, he made many fateful decisions. While a great advocate for the civil rights movement, Johnson decided to get the United States more deeply involved in Vietnam, whereas his predecessor, John F. Kennedy, had been leaning towards perhaps de-escalating our rather minimal involvement with advisor, quote-unquote, advisor, military advisor levels peaking at 16,000 in 1963. After a fateful event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson decided he was going to ramp up U.S. involvement in the war, and eventually the United States would take on the burden of fighting this war of protection against the communist menace in the name of containment for the South Vietnamese and against the North Vietnamese enemy in the communist Southern Vietnamese, Viet Cong. By 1965, the United States was becoming more deeply involved, and Life magazine, week after week, would cover major news events in the United States and around the world. The topic for this July 1965 article was the United States getting deeper and deeper into the war. And while the cover shows hardships, casualties, the reality of the brutality, Life magazine's editorial took a stance somewhat opposed to the implications of the cover. The hard realities of power demand that we must fight on. Life magazine was clearly a champion of the policy of containment. Enter General William Westmoreland in February of 1965, who became commander of U.S. combat forces in Vietnam as escalation began to take place. Little did the nation know in 1965 that by 1968, just 3 years later, U.S. troop commitments to Vietnam would rise to 580,000, many of those combat troops being draftees. February 1965 Life magazine cover shows a North Vietnamese stamp where the North Vietnamese military, proudly in their propaganda message, shoots down a United States Army helicopter, indicating that the determination of the Viet Cong enemy, the communist North Vietnamese enemy, needed to become more and more a part of U.S. policy. Blows, counterblows, tense weights, and the United States was determined to see the mission through. Supposedly on October 22, 1965, according to Time magazine, we were reaching a turning point in Vietnam. In other words, that U.S. military might, strategy, tactics, superior equipment, and the strength of will would see the day through, and that the war was beginning to be won. Life magazine chimed in February of 1966 with an editorial, Vietnam, the war is worth winning, as doubts among the general population, still a minority, began to rise as to whether or not it was worth fighting for. Anti-war movement in its infancy in 1965 began to grow in 1966. But still, Life stayed on board with the mainstream message. And in August of 1965, just about 1 year after the fateful Gulf of Tonkin incident, America's readers were again shown by the cover, reminded that our military might, our prowess, our technology, and our previous victory in World War II would see the mission through. The mighty fleet lashes out on South China Sea, and the vigilant eyes of trained American naval personnel and high-tech equipment would certainly win the day, would they not? Meanwhile, the draft is becoming ever more a present force, and younger people in the country begin to doubt the wisdom of the war after they have to pay the price by being taken out of their colleges, off of their high school campuses right after graduation, and being put into the United States military. The draft, who beats it and how? Protest movements begin to rise. No, it's not yet the anti-war hippies. These are still relatively clean-cut young folks who are beginning to doubt the wisdom of the war that America has decided to see through. Students for a Democratic Society, stop the bombing, end the war. And the flames of fury against the war begin to rise. October 1966, Life magazine still chronicles the harsh, brutal realities of the Vietnam War on the cover. Invasion, demilitarized zone runs into the Marines. And of course, our brave, well-trained, remarkable Marines are the ones that are going to slug it out. Marines being mostly enlistees, dedicated to the proposition